and welcome back to the Self-Selecting Podcast, episode 14. 14 episodes. We are doing it. Thank you so much for the comments left on episode 13, the one about PEDs. Really excited. That was one that was highly requested. And obviously, with that topic as a whole, I mean, you can imagine there's going to be a lot of nuance. There's going to be a lot of individuals who are like, this doesn't apply to me in any way. And if that's the case, that's fine. Leave your question in the comments below. If you're coming from Spotify, please leave me a review. I'm pretty sure you can leave me specifics there too. But if you're on YouTube, comment, subscribe, leave the specific follow-up question down in the comment section, and I'll be going through those, getting you some answers. If it's something that is a little more technical, if you don't want to share that information publicly, always shoot me an email. If it's something that you're like, hey, this is kind of pressing, I do offer one-on-one consults, and that's something that for the month of May, at least, I've got plenty of availability. That schedule, that calendar is wide open. One-on-one consults, they do not have to be just strictly PEDs. That can be anything that you want to talk about. In addition, if you're looking for one-on-one coaching, fat loss, building, competing, not competing, training, whatever it is, I am taking new clients. The information will be listed in the show notes, but let's go ahead and get started. So today, what are we talking about? So this is really common occurrence. I will have someone come to me, whether they're in sport, not in the sport, same idea here. They would like to have more muscle. They would like to have the curves that they see these girls online do. They want to be at a low body fat, not necessarily shredded. Yeah, some of them want to be shredded, but generally, they're at a body fat that is higher than their goal body fat, yet they can reflect and they know from previous dieting experiences that whatever that body fat is that they feel they're best at, they lack that shape. Now, this is usually very specific to the lower body, but hey, there are a lot of people who are also like, I want my arms to have shape to them too. I want people, when they see me at the gym, I want them to assume that I do this in some kind of capacity, not necessarily as a career or professionally, but I want that recognition. I want people to recognize, to be able to observe that I take care of my body, that I've put a lot of work into this, and that it's something that I take very seriously. Now, that gap between an individual who's like, okay, I'm as lean as I want to be, but I'm missing that key component. I'm missing the muscularity, the density. This is the part in your fitness journey, in your fitness career, whatever you want to call it, where you really separate from the pack. You really get to differentiate, okay, am I just interested in being trim, in being lean, or am I committed? Now, accepting that in order to do so, I think the conversation has to start with first recognizing that if you would like to build muscle, which that's really the focus here, is building. If you'd like to build muscle, it's going to require accepting that weight gain that comes with building muscle. I mean, if you were to lay it out and literally go through and be like, okay, even if I'm gaining at a P ratio that is favorable, so P ratio, the ratio of fat gain to muscle gain relative to total cumulative weight gain, if I'm gaining at very favorable P ratio, so muscle is going up, very minimal fat gain, even then, there's still going to be, it's going to be a smidge of fat gain that accompanies that, yes, but weight has to go up. There's no way to go about it in the sense where you're going to put on tissue while losing weight. Yet that is a common request. That's something that I get almost every intake form. So on my intake form, I have this section okay, list your primary goal, list your secondary goal. And I realized this past week, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to have to be more specific with this, because what I continue to run into are people that are on the primary goal, they're like, I want to lose fat and build muscle, which that's going to be problematic. Those two things, sure, as you build muscle, it can appear as if you've lost body fat because just relative to body fat percentage, if you increase the number of pounds, the actual, I guess, grams, whatever, of actual lean tissue, of muscularity, well, in turn, the percentage of body fat, because it's based on a percentage, the ratio of body fat to non-fat mass is going to move in the right direction. It's going to result in a technically lower body fat. Now, for most people, for this to actually matter, for this to actually accumulate to something that is significant, to that degree of a difference in body fat percentage, like a 3 to 5% difference, you're going to have to build a lot of muscle. And I mean, to do that, it's going to take a long time, particularly if you're teetering on that line of like gaining, losing, deficit, surplus, deficit, maintenance, back to a deficit because you got your period that week and maintenance felt a little weird and you didn't like how you looked, despite like actually being like relatively the same in terms of circumference. It's not an efficient process. So, you know, we've kind of talked about this before, but I really want to get into the weeds of what I mean when I say you need to have metrics in place to delineate between whether you are gaining muscle or gaining body fat. Now, the things I like to look at measurements, so the circumference. And for me personally, like I'm looking at my shoulders, my waist at the narrowest point, my waist at the widest point, my hips, so my actual glutes, the widest point, my glute fold, so like the crease of your butt, that is something that I'm measuring. Thighs at the largest point. Sure, if you have predominantly a lot of body fat, if you are predisposed to store body fat in your lower body, like particularly your legs, maybe you have multiple points on your legs. Like during prep, I would track my lower thigh versus my upper thigh because I'm also gauging adductor growth, and I'm trying to see, is there a significant difference in that as I'm trying to grow my glutes. And if that's the case, sure, you can have those multiple segments, but really, when we're getting into tracking the circumference, if we're gaining muscle, we should see these measurements increase. Now, to what degree should they increase? I mean, like we're not talking about much. Like in the course of a month, 1/4 of an inch would be insane. That would be ridiculous. And if that's what you're seeing, I mean, like, hey, you're on the right track, with the condition that calipers are not also going up at the same rate. Now, calipers, that is our second tool. That is the tool that is going to tell us whether or not there is an increase in body fat. So measurements, they don't exclusively measure muscle. They measure width, diameter. They're going to give you an idea as to whether you are getting bigger as a person. Now, bigger could be favorable. That could be something that we are absolutely on board with. But I would say collectively, most people, they do struggle with this. They struggle with the idea of getting bigger, even if they're not gaining body fat. It's something I've struggled with. I just, as my body gets bigger, as I take up more space, I'm like, this feels uncomfortable. Why? Because it's different. It's different than the goal that I've had in place for majority of my life. That goal being getting smaller, taking up less space. So measurements. Do they exclusively measure or indicate whether you're gaining muscle? No, but they can offer clues. They can offer signs into whether the weight that you're gaining is favorable. Now, calipers, on the other hand, I would say exclusively dictate whether or not you're gaining body fat. Now, the little asterisk that I'm going to put here is that calipers can be inflated. They can increase even if, let's say, you haven't gained body fat. Same line of thought when you see the scale weight go up. If you see scale weight go up, but you also look back, you're like, hey, I had a ton of sodium yesterday, or you know what, I'm right at that point in my cycle where I know that my hormones are fluctuating, and every month I see the same kind of just general blurring, softness, just water retention. Water retention can inflate caliper measurements. Now, for those who don't know what calipers are, like if you go to a gym, Most gyms are going to offer you, we'll do your body fat percentage with a skin fold site test. We'll use calipers. We will pinch using a tool or an electronic tool. Some of them have you stand on the thing, you hold on to whatever. I don't really trust those. I don't think they're very accurate. Pinchable skin fold sites. I prefer using a tool that is spring loaded because it's going to be pretty consistent every time, versus if you're using an electronic one and you actually have to push, like you have to squeeze it. This is really unnecessarily nitpicky. But for me, I'm like, how do you know that you are applying the same amount of pressure and it's pinching at the same, like that can vary. And the chance of calipers being mismeasured increases depending on who is doing them. So if you have a trainer, let's say if you're doing this at a gym, you have a trainer who is not very experienced and they're not very consistent. They don't use like a landmark on your body to determine, okay, like here at this mole, this is where I test for the lower glutes. Or if like they're actually going to pinch and like, and they're not using the same amount of pressure, these things, they can alter what that read is. Now, personally for me, I think the most consistent way, like originally I had someone else do it and I'm like, this is going to be much more accurate if I do it myself. Because like there can be some discrepancy, but like when we're talking about establishing continuity, well, I'm going to be able to feel like how much of a pinch there actually is. Okay. Getting a little too deep into calipers. Yes, they can be skewed whether or not you are holding onto a little bit more water that day. But I think the combination of measurements, so circumference, calipers, pinchable size, which on that, I take a multitude of caliper readings to determine, what is my gross pinchable fat? What is the total amount of fat that I'm measuring? But really, I mean, like looking at your fattest body parts, looking at your not fat body parts, your leanest body parts, and then looking at some areas that we know, like specifically we're like, we want this to grow or we don't want this to grow. So some examples of this, waist size, men or women, we don't necessarily want that to go up ever, no matter what phase we're in. Even if we're building, men, you are going to be predisposed. Most men are going to be predisposed to store body fat around their abdomen. That's very common. Women, we're going to be predisposed to store body fat around our upper thighs, that saddlebag area, if you will. It's kind of the way the cards are dealt by gender. But when we start looking at measuring these sites, so like for men and women, like we know that generally if circumference is going up around the waist, it's not a great indication that we're moving the right direction, because even if you're trying to add like abdominal thickness, you're trying to build your abs out. I mean, like that kind of growth typically would indicate visceral fat gain. So fat gain like in and around like the organs. Whereas if we're looking at something like for me, my delts, the circumference around my shoulders at the widest point, if that is growing, amazing. Like if that measurement is going up, perfect. I don't actually check like body fat percentage on my shoulders because I don't carry a lot of body fat there. Now what I'll say is like, okay, you've got abdomen. Okay, that generally shouldn't be going up in either circumference or caliper reading. Yet we are going to see generally some increase if you were in a push phase, because we're going to see some degree of body fat come on as we're growing. It doesn't have to be, and we actually don't want it to be at the same rate that scale weight is moving up. But we should keep an eye on it generally to ensure that that rate of change, like relative to body fat, that increase in caliper readings is not going up in a 1-to-1 ratio alongside measurements. That should not be happening. I would even say like a 2-to-1 ratio, that's still pretty aggressive. That's still fat that eventually you're going to have to go back and lose. So again, this all comes down to the efficiency of the quality of the weight that you're adding and ensuring that you're not creating additional makeup work that ultimately you're going to have to circle back to and be like, okay, well, great. I gained 5 pounds of muscle, but I gained 25 pounds of fat. Okay. That's not ideal. That's not what we're going for here. So going back, calipers. Okay. Glutes, that's an area like I know I tend to store body fat around that upper thigh area, lower glute area. It's also where my tie-ins generally fall. That's the area that I am in need of more muscle. So as as you're going through that phase, if that's you, okay, I want to see the measurements increase. Check. I want to see that. Now, the calipers will likely increase faster than, let's say, an area that I am not predisposed to store body fat in. So like my upper body, my serratus, even my abdomen, I don't carry a lot of body fat there. So it's like where I'm going to see, like just this is individualized, where I'm going to see body fat go up relatively soon is that lower glute, upper thigh area, even quads. Like I tend to see those calipers increase, yet I'm not seeing them increase in those other areas. Now, it's important to, yes, track the weekly changes, but then also identify, okay, like what body parts are getting fatter. Because you can have circumference go up without calipers going up very quickly. And generally, if we're seeing measurements, like measurements continue to push up like faster and faster, great. That shows that something is happening there. Now, how do we delineate this relative to scale weight? Well, personally, this is going to depend on the amount of runway that you have. So the scale needs to go up when you're gaining muscle. If the scale is not going up, there's a little bit of gray area where like you can be like, okay, well, the scale isn't technically moving up, but my next process, the next step I'm going to go to, the next point of evaluation is going to be, are my measurements going up? If measurements are going up, okay, cool. Are my calipers going up? The thing we're looking for there, no, calipers aren't going up, or they're going up like very minimally, like 2-3 millimeters. Like that's nothing. That's very, very mild. The next thing we want to look at is training performance. Is training performance going up? Really, the training performance, that needs to be something that is measurable. And y'all know that I've talked about this so many times at this point, but like if you aren't on a program where you can consistently compare movements, working sets in like the same modalities week to week, it's going to be very hard to determine if you're progressing in training. Now, sure, if you're running like a 6-week block and okay, like you make an adjustment and you switch up like the types of movements, but generally the volume on a weekly basis or a daily basis for that workout, as long as you're not going from like a 3-day lower split to like a 1-day lower split, like making wild swings like that, like sure, you're going to see training block to training block. There will likely be big variations just due to overall systemic inflammation. But assuming that you're not doing that, at the very least, having something in place to where you can say, okay, I am hitting the same movements every single week. I'm doing them in the same way. So there aren't these vast swings in training volume specific to a body part. Even if weight isn't going up on the bar or on the machine or, the exercise, is the quality of the rep, is that improving? Okay, great. Let's say it is. Amazing. We want scale weight to go up simultaneously alongside. We want it to be linearly correlated with improvements in training performance. So that progression we should see running alongside each other. Now, let's say training performance isn't going up though. Well, this is the point where we really got to ask, like, okay, how are you looking? Like, scale weight's going up. To what degree? Is it a very rapid increase? Are you gaining it like 1 pound a week? That in itself, depending on your size, maybe for a larger male, that's not very much. For a smaller female, that could be a lot. That could be very significant. And if you're seeing those rapid jumps that are not tied to hormonal imbalances, hormonal shifts, I shouldn't even say imbalances, hormonal shifts, variations in like sodium intake, carb intake. Because remember, like for every gram of carb you have, like if you were going from like no carb or very, very low carb one day, and then you're like ramping them up the next day, if you're constantly cycling back and forth, you could see that very easily reflected on the scale, because for every 1 gram of carb, you're going to hold like 3 to 4 grams of water. So when you look at that, okay, that's like 4 to 5 grams of additional weight. It's like 450 grams in a pound. Okay, well, depending on how high your intake is, that could absolutely make a difference. That could be an inflation in either direction, either a drop or an increase. So being cognizant of that program design, that from a dietary standpoint, how that's going to affect your read on the scale weight is essential. And, we're kind of deep into this, like 20 minutes in almost. This is where like my objective metrics for my clients, like I have them track sleep, water, bowel movements, training performance, step count. Like I have them track all these things because ultimately I'm trying to go through this process where I can eliminate any doubt as to whether that scale weight is an inaccurate read. When I got into like bodybuilding as a whole, it was very common. I still think it's very common today for people to be like, yeah, just grab that weekly check-in, just take your weight that day. I don't want you to get obsessive with the scale. And like, I understand if the scale is like a trigger point for you, I get not stepping on it. Full transparency, like it was a trigger point for me for most of my life. Like, that would like literally dictate how I felt about my body. Most days, like early on, I was not in a good place with the scale. And really, I think when that changed, it was when I was like, you know what, I'm going to take my scale weight every single day. I'm going to normalize these fluctuations. I'm going to see that, like, frankly, these fluctuations happen whether I'm on track or not. Like, they are a very normal part of this process. And there are factors that obviously they can't be quantified to the extent that I'd like them to be, because even if changing like no variables, repeating the exact same day with the exact same intake, no shifts in like fluid and sleep and recovery, like, just to the best of my ability, still these fluctuations, like we're talking like a 3-pound difference between my low and my high every week. That's the norm. And if you don't have a way to, I would really say like audit whether that scale weight reading is 100% accurate, that is where you need to start, because that's going to make gaining weight much more mentally fatiguing. I would say, particularly if you're someone who's always struggled with it. If it's something that out the gate, like you're just very intimidated to get started with, even men, like that's something that I find a lot of people struggle with. I'm fortunate that a lot of people do come to me and they're like, hey, let me lay it out on the table. This is something that's very hard for me to do. This is something that's very hard for me to admit. But really, like, the fact of the matter is you have to assess why you're even making this decision to build. And I think for a lot of people, I think they kind of get lost in the idea of, okay, in order to have the physique that I want to have, in order to get to that finish line, the only approach I need to take is being in a deficit, creating a deficit, being very tight, being very trim, being restricted. Whereas what we see is that a lot of times people will get down to that body fat goal. They will get down to their leanest physique. What do you know? They're like, oh, I didn't have as much muscle as I nearly thought. Actually, in order to look the way I want to look, I'm going to have more muscle. I'm going to need more density, more size. I'm going to need to be stronger. And this was a challenge for me for majority of my time in bodybuilding. It really became it became apparent at a certain point, because I was like, okay, what is the opportunity cost? The opportunity cost here. I'm having to compensate so much in so many ways in order to bring the physique that I need to bring, like the minimum visibility I need for my tie-ins. I'm having to get so lean in other areas because I do lack the balance. I don't have the muscularity. So in turn, like I'm doing this thing, I'm working against my body. Whereas if I just put on more muscle, not only does it solve the problem of not having enough muscle, but it also makes it to where I'm not having to compensate with conditioning. I'm not having to get nearly as lean, like objectively to a lower body fat percentage for where I need to go. I'm also not having to compensate with posing. All of these things, these are benefits. And you take the stage away, okay? So for the non-competitor, it's like, I can tell you, there's a lot of people that in their mind, it's like, okay, they're using one metric, one body part to determine, okay, like I want to achieve this. I want to achieve no cellulite on the back of my legs or whatever, around my glutes. Okay, I want to do that. But if you don't have enough glute, and this isn't just limited to the competitor. I mean, like, you look at the non-competitor, and this, honestly, this is the hardest part, is moving in the opposite direction that you've always moved. thus far. You've always moved in the direction of restricting food. You've always moved towards having a tighter physique. So to actually hit pause on that and be like, okay, we're going to actively move in the other direction, and we're going to do this for an extended period of time. It's not going to be just 8 weeks or 6 weeks. Some people really have this idea, okay, we're going to build for 6 weeks and we're just going to be good. It's like, no, this is going to take a long time. And this is where most people stop. This is where most people pause and they're like, you know what, I don't want to do this. I'm not ready to do this, because it makes sense. Like, I get it. It's hard. It's hard to wake up every day and put forth the same amount of effort into something that, frankly, seemingly, like, both intrinsically and externally, like you're like, this is moving me further away from my goals. It's hard, and hard feels shitty. But this is where most people, they tap out. They're like, okay, I'm going to continue to compete. And I just, I like being lean. And I feel like that thought process, that concept of like, okay, well, I just like sitting leaner year round. It's a bit of an excuse if you are someone who's scared, if you're someone who's nervous, because ultimately what you're doing is you're deciding that, like, okay, I get to stay in this realm of comfortability. I get to stay in a place where I'm controlling the outcome. I'm controlling the outcome of not getting past a certain body fat percentage, not getting to a certain weight on the scale. It's familiar, and I get it. It comes from, for most people, I think it comes from a place of being fearful that they're not going to be able to pull back, that eventually it's going to be misconstrued. It's going to be, even internally, they're going to feel as if they are being lazy, as if they're not working as hard. Whereas, like, when you're dieting and you see the scale weight like change, when you see that drop, it's super motivating. It's a big ask to tell someone that, like, hey, like, not only are you going to have to forego that, you're going to have to forego that motivation, you're also going to have to strive for new numbers on the scale that, frankly, like, maybe you've never seen. Maybe if you've been restricted your entire life, maybe if you've always sat very comfortably, you might find that, like, no, it's going to take several points past what your highest weigh-in has been. Yes, the goal is that we do this in a way that's conducive with more muscle than body fat, but some body fat, it's going to accrue. So this is where I really want to know, okay, what's your fuel? What's the motivation? Because I think a lot of people have this idea that they're going to go into a build phase. They're going to start a growth phase, and that motivation is going to come pretty soon after entering that state. You get a little bit more food, performance goes up, and yeah, I would hope, and maybe there is this honeymoon period where you're like, okay, like, this actually feels a lot better than it did when I was on 1,400 calories doing, multiple hours of cardio a week. I tend to see that. Some people, they live that out, and maybe they ride it out for, the first 4 to 6 weeks. But eventually you hit the point where you're like, okay, I'm numb to the performance increases. Actually, I'm starting to feel a little self-conscious, a little unsettled about, maybe like it's a stomach thing, which, like, it sounds silly, but like, so many people, they're like, hey, if my stomach feels full, if I feel like I'm bloated, if I feel like I'm carrying like more weight, I feel a little heavier, that's going to fuck with me throughout the entire day. That's going to fuck with me in my training. It's going to fuck with me whenever I get up. I'm going to second guess the kind of clothes I should wear, the outfits, that I buy, whatever. For me, my last build, this hit me at a certain weight. And I can tell you that weight, right around 140, that's when I start to feel like, don't love this nearly as much. 130 to 140 is a fun honeymoon period. It's great. Even like 137, I start to get a little nervous. I'm like, oh, I can kind of see the end approaching. 140 and up, 140 to 145, that's where things start to get tough mentally. Now, this is where I really think you need to harness, you need to tap into your fuel, your internal, and this isn't a motivation, but this is your why. And for the record, if you go into a build and you're like, you know what, like, I don't have the motivation to even get started. Like, Corey, how do I convince myself that this is actually worth it? Well, I can't tell you this is going to work for everyone, but for me, it wasn't so much finding a positive motivation. Like, there was no, like, imagery or really even like visualization that I would say helped me. It was rather looking at everything that I had done thus far, how hard I'd worked, and how dissatisfied I was with that final outcome, and really honing in on that feeling. The feeling I had at the end of my fat loss phases where I was around girls who were much bigger than me, who had much better glutes. And I mean, granted, like I believe I train really hard. I believe I'm doing everything that I can to get the most out of my efforts. But seeing other people, it wasn't in more of like a jealousy sense or even a comparison sense, but just a realization that like I don't have the glutes that I want to have, or I don't have, my shoulders are fine. I'm not bitching about those. I don't have the glutes that I want to have. I don't have that curvy shape. I have such a my waist is so small, but like the fact is my glutes are not big enough to create the ratios that I want, that I need to be competitive. And like that idea that I guess, sorry, I want to go two ways with this. Your idea of your standard for what you want out of your body, how you want your body to look. Don't sell yourself short. I think the higher you can set the bar, if you're someone who's like, hey, I want to look like Laura Lee, like that's the look that I want to have. I want to have that degree of muscle. Amazing. Set it there. But then you need to calibrate your expectations in contrast with what you're willing to forego in order to work towards that goal. And maybe that goal does require, a 5-year process. Maybe the place you're in right now is so far from that. So you're committed. It's going to take a lot of time. And if it is, amazing. But just ensuring that like, hey, are you doing the things that are actually going to get you there? Because if that's a 5-year goal to get to Laura Lee's glutes, and I just use her because she's some of the biggest glutes in the top of the sport. If that's the goal and you're like, okay, realistically, the amount of pounds that's a pretty big gap. If you're competing every year, or maybe you're not competing, but you're in your growth phase or off season, and you're like, yeah, but I got vacation coming up, so I'm going to cut down. Oh, well, I'm starting to feel like a little uncomfortable, so I just want to make sure I'm not getting too far off. It's not to say like one isolated, like, okay, you decide this makes sense to go into a mini cut. But if you're not being productive and like showcasing through all of your efforts that you're actually working towards that goal, well, all it's going to be is this mile marker we're kind of glancing over at, like, oh yeah, one day, but like there's really nothing occurring in the present that's moving you closer. You're kind of just idling. Now, for some people, it's not even a matter of like persuading them that they need to go through this growth phase. You don't need persuasion when you have compliance. And I'm fortunate that a lot of people, like majority of the people that come to me, they're like, hey, I'm fed up with the final product. I want to build, and I want to do so in a way I'm okay to use drugs, but I only want to use them if absolutely necessary. I want to really ensure that I've maxed out everything that I can do naturally, or secondary to that, okay, I'm ready to take drugs. I feel like I've maxed out everything I can do. I would like to put something in place. I just want to do it in a relatively safe way. And for those people, it's like, okay, the compliance is assumed that it's already, I assume it's already going to be there if you come to me with that information. If you come to me with that, I guess that opening statement. If you don't have that, because I also find this, like I'll get those clients who say exactly that. And they're like, but here's the caveat. I struggle gaining weight. I struggle letting myself gain weight. And if that's you, okay, it doesn't mean that we can't work together. It doesn't mean that the answer is to not go into a build, or the answer is to go into a build aggressively. Really, our starting point is figuring out how to persuade yourself that there's value in complying to a plan like this, a plan that facilitates muscle growth. Now, personally, I'm much more motivated by pain, discomfort, dissatisfaction. Those feelings are motivating for me. Some people are more motivated running towards something. So you kind of got to weigh these two options out. What motivates you more? Running towards something or running away from something? It's going to be highly individualized. I mean, I can tell you that for me, dissatisfaction ruins me. It's something that haunts me, and I ruminate on it. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's something that has allowed me to chase endeavors that frankly, if I was just hoping, working towards this, facade of this better outcome, I don't know if I would be in the same place. Really, the fear of not changing, the fear of continuing to have that dissatisfaction at the end of a fat loss phase, that is ultimately what drove me to commit to an intentional growth phase, commit to eating the food, commit to all of the loose ends, the open tabs that, frankly, all of these things, they matter. They might only move the needle like 1 or 2%, but others will move it much more than that, like diet, sleep, hydration, training. But I think the real issue comes in when you don't have that compliance, when someone puts themselves in this position where they're like, okay, I'm going to commit to a growth phase, signing up with Corey, cool, we get started. And I'm going to tell you, I've had this happen so many times where we'll get going, 3 weeks in, someone's feeling uncomfortable, they're not communicating this, it's not being like noted in their check-in, and then finally week 4 through 6. I mean, that's typically when I see this happen for most people who fall into this type of client. They're like, I don't think I can keep doing this. I'm so uncomfortable with my body. I don't feel very lean at all. This is the heaviest I've been. I don't think I can commit to another, let's just say 8 to 12 weeks of this. That just seems impossible. Like, how heavy am I going to actually get? And I look a little deeper and I'm like, okay, well, looking back on check-ins, I'm like, like, you know what, this person, yeah, they didn't mention this in those first few weeks, but my inclination, I'm like, they probably felt this way week 1, week 2, week 3. They probably were already experiencing mild transient thoughts that ultimately led them to feel like, okay, I'm done. I can't continue forward. Or I'm at the point where this is so overwhelming that I feel like the only solution is to enter into a mini cut. Now, this conversation at this point with a client who's like, hey, like I'm ready to tap out the first month and a half in, typically goes something like this. I want to pose the question, and for me, this is resemblant of the internal dialogue I have. I'm gonna go like, okay, if I continue to do the thing that I'm doing right now, if I continue to do this for the next 5 years, what does that look like? And to be frank, like this isn't just about like building, like this is my decision-making process with any kind of habits, good or bad. But when I'm assessing like, okay, whether this is something that is productive, whether this, is worth the risk or worth the time, worth the mental fatigue, because fuck, I will run that one into the ground, just circling around. I try to ask myself, if I were to continue to do this, if I were to continue with this behavior, what would that look like? And I don't just skip past that visualization, that I guess that imagery down the road. I'm really trying to consider, okay, well, like am I prepared for the compounding effects of, let's say in this case, like building, like am I prepared to go through another series of, let's just say like whatever, 2 shows a year for 5 years. Okay, so am I willing to go through 5 more seasons of bodybuilding feeling the same way? Will I still be the same person if I do that? Or will that start to really weigh on me? Will I start to question whether I'm a good athlete? Will I start to resent this passion that I have? Will I start to, and I mean, I know myself pretty well. I don't think I'd ever start to begin pointing fingers or like, oh, this isn't fair because X, Y, and Z. But that is something that like very, very commonly, like I see like girls in the sport who are like, you're under muscled. They're also the ones that are conveniently like, oh, she got this treatment because she looks this way and because she's on this team and because she's associated with this company. And it's like, those things all might be valid, but it doesn't change the fact that like you are now assessing something that you lack, a deficit that is within your control, and you're giving someone else the power, really the responsibility to dictate that outcome. Whereas there's no ownership reflected back at you. Like whoever you blame, they have the power. So in this case, like you're blaming someone's potential nepotism or advantages. Like in reality, is there anything more you can do? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've competed a lot at this point while still, very stubbornly committed to, what I'm just going to continue to play my game. For some reasons that makes sense, for others that don't. It wasn't until the point that I was like, okay, I'm putting so much into this sport, like financially, emotionally, physically, yes, but like I'm putting so much into it. And at this point, what I'm avoiding is ultimately the thing that is going to help create the best outcome in the long run. Like any excuse that we hide behind, it just allows us to make that behavior easiest. And it's usually because of a lack of skill. So in this case with building, like there's a lot of people, they're like, no, it's just the drugs. I just need to take drugs. Like that is a constant interaction that I have with new clients, potential clients, is like, oh yeah, I've got everything else ironed out. Like I'm good. Like on the diet, I'm super adherent. I'm one of those, I'll put my head down and work. Oh God, it pisses me off just saying that, because there's one person I can think of like off the bat that I ended up like firing, because like that was literally verbatim. She's like, I will do whatever it takes. And literally like she wanted drugs. She wanted me to just tell her to take the drugs. And like past that, the feedback I gave her that was like, oh, like your training's not that great. Your adherence is actual trash. Like, I mean, like you think you're being adherent, and it feels good to tell yourself that this is the effort that is required for 100% adherence. But girl, you've got some learning to do. I can promise you, to get to where I need you to be from an adherence standpoint, it's going to be very, very uncomfortable. I digress. It's typically, in this case, it's the lack of skill and the understanding of like, okay, what is it going to take to actually grow, that ultimately enables this behavior, this cycle of like, okay, well, I'll be in a non-diet phase. I'll do that for a short amount of time. But as soon as things get uncomfortable, it's like, okay, we're going to pull back. Or the assertion, and kind of going back to what I just said, the assertion that it's the drugs lacking, that ultimately that's why the progress is lacking. In reality, I've throughout my time coaching, like there's been so few people that are just missing the drugs. The drugs are the only component that are missing. Most people have a lot of room for improvement. And even then, it's like that in itself, just the improvements outside of the drugs, the improvements in the actual program design, that can pull out progress, which is what we need to see. We need to see, like, that's our confirmation that you weren't doing everything to the best of your ability, whether there was an actual lack of skill or not. I really think for a lot of people, defending their deficits, that is ultimately what is stunting their growth. That is what is keeping them stuck in the same position every diet, every off season. There's always an excuse. And like, I get it. It's hard to really, push the branches back and to dig into like, okay, where is this coming from? But understanding that, yeah, it usually is one thing. It usually is, maybe it's not even another person. Maybe it's just you yourself. If you really struggle with body image and you're like, I barely hold it together when I'm lean because I hate my body image so much and it's a constant stressor. And this is the only time that I've, clung to some semblance of not hating my body. So like the idea of even like relinquishing some grip there, it's terrifying. Well, yeah, like it's embarrassing to admit that. I understand it. I do. Like it's really, to me, it's the most embarrassing for myself when I realize I'm in control of it. When I realize that like, oh, this thing that like really, really causes me a lot of strain and a lot of suffering, I'm also the warden. I'm also the cause. Like we put it in the shadows because it makes us feel shitty. But I mean, like digging a little deeper and figuring out, okay, what's the real reason? That ultimately is going to get you on the right path. I think you have to remember that like this part of the sport, not even the sport of like getting on stage, being a competitor, but the act of bodybuilding, of working towards a better physique. This phase is part of a broader strategy that ultimately is putting you in a position where you can have a better outcome the next time you diet. And like, I get it. Like, you have this feeling of being overweight compared to where you were previously. For many, many people, like seeing that scale hit an all-time high, that in itself, regardless of how you look, can be very unsettling. And I think this is where a lot of people, they escalate this problem. They take something that is a practical problem, they make it an emotional problem. Scale weight goes up. Okay, well, is this because you gained a bunch of body fat? Hopefully not. Hopefully not. It could be. Like, it really could be. But at that point, if it's because you gained a bunch of body fat, which I can tell you, like, for clients who, like, their weight shooting up like 1.5 pounds a week, sure, there might be one week I let it slide and I'm like, yeah, it's not great, but that's much faster than we were aiming for. Like, I mean, trust me, like, we're talking about a very like reasonable amount of weight gain on a weekly basis. I'm talking about like 0.25% weekly, bi-weekly. Like, it's hardly anything, trust me. Like, it's not much. And I mean, sure, there are some clients who like 1 pound a week for multiple weeks, somehow they pull it off. Measurements are going up, calipers are not going up. The look is there. And you know what? Like, they're making leaps and bounds ahead from what I initially anticipated. It's not going to be everyone. And for the client that's like, okay, they go up 1.5 pounds this week. The next week they go up 2 pounds. So now we're up like 3.5 pounds in 2 weeks. I'm like, all right, dude, we got to figure this out, because like, I can tell you, your physique is not reflecting that this is largely muscle gain. And I mean, that's honestly where I think a lot of people get it wrong. Like, in these intentional growth phases, people can get caught up in this fantasy that this means that they're going to eat whatever they want and not have to demonstrate any kind of mental fortitude and discipline around their diet. But the people that I've seen get the best results that I've seen are when I am diligently tracking. Like, I'm being very honest. Like, my last build, I think I had 2 untracked meals the entire time. And even then, it wasn't like ridiculous. It wasn't like apps, dinner, and dessert, and then snacks later. It wasn't a cheat day. Listen, like, I'm a glutton. I do like food a lot, but to avoid those speed wobbles, to avoid those points in an intentional growth phase where you get a little, like, mentally you get a little fucky and like, you're like, I don't think we're moving in the right direction. I think we took some wrong steps here. To avoid that, tracking, honestly, a high degree of food reporting, these are your tools. And like, to the degree in which you lean on them, ultimately it is up to the client's comfortability with weight gain. A client who is very, very hesitant to gain weight, I need to see that, like, your demonstration of like food reporting, like what is actually being tracked, like in your FitnessPal, or the adherence, like, to your diet, like, you know, for a meal plan. If that's not high, you don't really have a leg to stand on when it comes to complaining about the weight gain. If it truly is like, unless it truly is unintentional. And in that case, I mean, like, there are lots of ways as a coach that I can like pull food down and like make it to where you're not consistently getting into states of overages or misreporting. And this is where I think a lot of people, they begin to take weight gain personally. It becomes a very emotional experience for them, because they see the weight go up and they think it's a direct reflection that they're doing something wrong, when in reality it's like, no, if it's going up at a steady rate, if you're only in a slight surplus, like, I mean, like 200-300 calories, like, I mean, we shouldn't see it go up that much. A 1 pound increase is going to be 500 calorie surplus per day for 7 days. Now, there are ways we can buffer this. There are ways that we can mitigate some of those damages. But if we're not trying to gain 1 pound a week, if we're trying to gain 0.5 pound a week, which is still like, that's really like the average. I don't want people going over that by much. It's 250 calories a day. 1/4 pound a week, like, we're talking like you're at 125 calories above maintenance. Like, that's nothing. I think the hardest thing for me to reconcile, looking back, is like, there were so many times that I did that yo-yo approach where I was like, okay, I'm committed to growing. I'm going to be growing. And then like very soon after, the minute I got uncomfortable, I'm like, and now we're dieting and now we're back into a deficit. And frankly, it's like those moments, they've made it incredibly hard, because not only did I not make very much progress at all during that initial state. But then I got into the repeated cycle of thinking like, okay, this threshold, 137, 140, that's where I start dieting again. And sure, yes, there is a cap to like the weight you should get to when you're trying to grow, but there should be some intentionality with how this is designed. You should be able to sit in these phases for an appropriate amount of time relative to what the goal is. And this isn't to say like there are some people, I just had a client yesterday who we are about to round out her 12 weeks. She's been in a build for 12 weeks. Her weight has hardly moved up. I mean, like maybe 4 to 5 pounds in 3 months, which is phenomenal. That's amazing. She came to me. She was very honest. She's like, hey, this is very uncomfortable for me. It's something I want to do. It's something I trust you doing. However, there's going to be a point where I'm close to tapping out and I want to be able to communicate that with you. And she hit that point this week, week 11. She's like, hey, I'm at the point where I don't think I can keep going. I'm not comfortable with it. And granted, her body fat is so like, I mean, she could easily continue pushing another, 3 pounds, but it's like, what's the return on that effort? And really what's best for her right now? We agreed early on in the relationship, okay, she's going to communicate. Let me know if she is uncomfortable and let me know when she hits that orange. Don't tell me when you're at the red, when you're like, okay, I just can't do this at all anymore. Like I have to start a cut. There really is a sequence for everything that we do. And when it comes to determining from an individual's basis, whether they've hit that threshold for that, this is too intense, this is too much for me. It comes down to having to solve for what's the most important thing. What's the thing that has to happen right now? For this girl, like if I were to continue with the build and be like, no, just suck it up for another 4 to 6 weeks, is she going to be as productive? No, because like now we've broken trust too. I told her initially, I'm like, tell me when you get to that point where you're having more bad days than good days, like consistently, like not over the course of like 1 week, maybe it's before your period, but like I need to know when the bad days are really becoming mentally taxing. And then at that point we will do something, but that was laid out at the beginning. So telling her like, no, we just got to keep going. Like you just got to, dial in, like that would be great. Frankly, I don't think she has, I think she has the discipline. I think she's a very disciplined person, but I think the discipline required to get to that next state, to get to the next phase where maybe in the next build, I am like, hey, I really want you to ride it out for another 3 to 4 weeks. Just lock it in and then we'll go into a cut. I think that's going to come with time. I think that's going to come also with her trusting that like, hey, I did see out a 3-month build. I didn't absolutely hate myself. And I did it under the right supervision. I did it with someone that I trust that also understands the individual challenges that I have around gaining weight. And ultimately, yes, it might be what's best for me, but right now it's not what's best in this moment at that athlete's current skill level. And I think that's where a lot of people like they miss the priority constraint. And they go straight to, okay, what is optimal? What's best for this individual? And this can go both ways. You can have the person who's like, hey, like it's actually best if I stay a little bit leaner, and they miss really the forest for the trees when it comes to growth and what's happening in this non-prep setting. Then you get the individual who's in the growth phase and they are constantly teetering back and forth between, okay, I need to cut, I need to build, missing that, hey, in neither of these phases, either phase, we are losing not only time, but we're losing a lot of the mental, I would say, acuity needed to see these out to their fullest potential, because we're not actually sitting in them long enough to see the outcome that we're hoping for. So both outcomes are ultimately underwhelming. So it's like at this point, you have to ask yourself, okay, you have something that you need to give up in order to get to where you want to go, in order to see out your physique goals. Is it worth giving up? The individual that's like, I really like staying lean. Okay, is it worth giving that up temporarily in order to get to your destination? Because that's the only way you're going to get there. And I think the same rule of thumb applies, and there are far fewer people who run into this issue, but God love them. They're just so much better than all of us who struggle with dietary restriction of any sort. It's the individual who struggles with gaining, struggles with eating enough food to support their goals, whether that be physique or strength. Performance athlete, okay, like you're trying to get stronger, well, that's going to take consistently pulling food up to support whatever your needs are. And I mean, they kind of go hand in hand. If you're in, like, for the female athlete, for the athletes that I'm speaking to, I mean, like, sure, drugs or not, your performance has to be going up in order to see out these physique outcomes. Like, and yes, we can get into the whole, like, okay, like intensity and volume and training style, but ultimately performance does have to be going up. And if performance isn't going up, it's going to be really hard for these growth phases to be as effective, to know that these growth phases are as effective as they could be. For this individual that, like, is struggling to gain weight, I mean, God, like, I know it can be hard, like the physical discomfort of putting in food, but I talked about this a little bit in, like, episode 12, is like, you know, you start your day and, like, you make those decisions around, like, okay, what do I have on hand? What are my resources? But I think, like, to take it a step further and to build off of that, it's not just doing that at the beginning of the day. It's thinking, like, okay, I have to get in X number of calories. It's same thing. I do the same shit with, like, water. Is like, when I'm struggling to hit that requirement, I'm like, okay, I'll just use food for simplicity, but it's like, okay, you need to hit 2,000 calories. You're going to break that up over 4 meals. Well, if you skip one of those meals, you're kind of fucking yourself, because now you have an additional 250 calories to add to meals that were 500 calories that let's assume you struggle to ingest that at once. Let's assume that that's a very big ask for you. And if it is, being honest that, like, okay, if I miss that meal 2 or that meal 3 because of something work related, what is my game plan? So in this case, if this were me, which this is not me, I do not struggle to eat food. I am, even when I'm building, I struggle to not overeat food. It's just, it's the way, yeah. If that's you, knowing that, okay, like, you know, I skipped meal 2, so those calories now have to be redistributed. What are the easiest ways I can get this in? Liquid calories. Oh my God. Get the oat milk. Like, it's the easiest thing. Put your protein shake in the oat milk. Put some dates in the thing. Like, I get it for men. I understand that, like, sometimes, and like, I'm going on this, I know I am. I do get it for men. If you have a really high threshold, if you're burning a lot of calories, if you have a lot of muscle mass, if your caloric requirement to gain is so high, just because of where you're at in your career, yeah, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to probably require more planning on your part. But for females my size, dates, 2 of them, that takes up no stomach volume. I swear to God, like, put them in your purse, like, put them in a little Ziploc baggie. You should be leaning into these high calorie foods that the rest of us have to avoid. Like, I know, like, I'm kind of coming at this aggressively, but, like, I know this is a real problem for some people. And trust me, I do have some clients who they're like, hey, like, my intake is, as a female, they're like, I'm 130 pounds. My intake's 2,800. They do have a lot of muscle, and they're also like, yeah, I burn a lot of calories throughout the day. So it's just the state that they're in currently in order to gain. And for them, it is assessing, okay, like, what are these high volume, low calorie foods that we have in place? Is there a reasonable replacement? Do we have things that, like, literally take up less space? Also reflecting on the nutrient timing, you know, for the day. Like, I really think, like, if getting in enough calories is, like, a consistent issue for you, that first meal, like, hit it hard. The longer you put it off throughout the day, I mean, like, you're just going to have to make it up. And that first meal, it doesn't mean, like, eat 50% of your calories then, like, but simple math, you need to hit 500 calories per meal. You want to do it over 4 to 5 meals. Okay. Divide that out. The minute that you realize, hey, I'm going to be skipping one of these meals, don't put that decision off, because I can promise you, like, for most people, what's going to end up happening is you're going to get to the end of the night and you're going to be like, well, I just had my meal 4. That was 500 calories, maybe 750. Maybe I tried to make up some. I'm stuffed because my meal 3 and my meal 4 were so, you know, closely stacked together. I only had an hour in between. So I really just had, like, 1,200 calories, like, in the course of 3 hours. I have to eat more. I'm trying to go to bed. Like, I'm going to be up all night. Like, I'm going to have indigestion. It's like, That's the worst case scenario that you want to avoid. You want to avoid putting yourself into a situation where, I don't want to even call it a mistake, but like for simplicity, let's just say you skipped meal 2 or meal 3 for some good reason. Let's say it was justified. You skip that. So you made a mistake here, or you made a deviation. Don't allow that deviation to then cause issues later in the day surrounding your other meals, to cause further deviations. That's what I'm trying to say. It's getting to the hour, 10-minute mark, so words are hard. If you're in that position, and it's the same thing, honestly, just invert this to apply to food restriction, is like, you go a little bit over early in the day. What are our tools? What are our strategies in order to prevent future deviations, future overages? Well, maybe that is leaning on some carbonated beverages. Maybe that is distracting ourselves, finding other activities. Maybe that is restructuring an entire meal that like would be really easy to eat, that is a little bit higher calorie, lower volume, and being like, you know what, I'm gonna get the salad, and I'm gonna make sure that I make it very voluminous so that I don't have that low volume meal that I was originally gonna have, ultimately making it to where I'm really hungry right before bed. Invert that. Same if you struggle getting food in. Don't let those decisions, those deviations become compounding. And I mean, like, it's one of those things, like, if either avenue is a struggle for you with hitting whatever your energy needs are, that's really how I started this whole thing an hour and almost a half ago. If you're struggling to keep up or work within whatever your needs are, yes, look at the food selection, look at the nutrient timing, and look at ways to make it to where the efforts you're having to put forth on a daily basis are as little as possible. Because I mean, ultimately, the higher those constraints are, the more discipline you have to demonstrate on a day-to-day basis, the less likely it is you're going to stick to that plan. The less likely it is you're going to tap out at the 4 to 6 week mark and be like, absolutely, fuck this. Like, this is way too hard. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. That's really what I'm trying to say. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope this was helpful. As always, like, comment, subscribe. If you're interested in coaching, I have a ton of availability in May as well for one-on-one consults. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I will see you in the next one.